What prevents me from being baptized? A man says this from inside a chariot in the middle of nowhere to a stranger he met an hour ago. There is no church, no temple, no crowd, just a desert road, a scroll of Isaiah, and a question with nothing polite about it. Luke tells us this man was Ethiopian, a court official under Kandake, queen of a kingdom far south of Egypt, entrusted with her entire treasury. He had traveled well over 1,000 miles to worship in Jerusalem, and when he arrived, the same law he had crossed a continent to honor would not let him all the way in. He went anyway. He worshiped from the edge, and on the road home, still holding the scroll, still holding the question no one in Jerusalem had answered for him, a man named Philip climbed into his chariot and gave him the one thing he never expected to receive that day, an answer. This is the man the New Testament never names, a man of real power who spent his life on the outside of something he wanted in, and the few minutes on a desert road that changed which side of the line he stood on. If you're new here, this is After the Miracle, where we go looking in the places Scripture goes quiet. Subscribe if that question already has your attention, because his story doesn't start on the road. It starts years earlier in a palace with a decision made about his body that he never made himself. Start with the two worlds this man carried inside him at the same time, because neither one is small. The first world is Meroë. Luke calls him an Ethiopian, but the region the ancient world meant by that name was not the country that carries the name today. It was the kingdom of Kush, sometimes called Nubia, centered on the city of Meroë, far up the Nile in what is now Sudan. Modern archaeology has confirmed a great deal of what Luke assumes his readers already know. Pyramids still stand at Meroë, smaller and steeper than Egypt's, but numerous, the burial ground of a dynasty that had already ruled for over 1,000 years by the time this man was born. This was not a minor tribal outpost on the edge of the map. It was a wealthy, literate, gold-producing kingdom that had fought Rome to a standstill in living memory and negotiated a peace on its own terms. And it was ruled at the very top by a woman. Luke writes that this man served under Kandake, queen of the Ethiopians. Kandake was not her name. It was her title, a Meroitic royal office, roughly meaning Queen Mother, held by a line of powerful women who sometimes ruled as full sovereigns in their own right, not merely as consorts standing beside a king. Stone inscriptions from Meroë confirm the title across generations. We cannot say with certainty which Kandake this man served. The strongest candidates from the period are Amanitore or her successor, but we don't need the exact name to understand the world he came from. He worked at the center of power in a kingdom where a woman's authority over a treasury, an army, and a nation was not an exception. It was simply how Kush was governed. Within that world, he had risen about as high as a person could rise without wearing the crown himself. Luke's phrase is specific. He was in charge of her entire treasury. In the royal courts of the ancient Near East and the Nile Valley alike. This was a documented and deliberate use of eunuchs, men who, unable to found rival dynasties of their own, were trusted precisely because a treasury in their hands could not become a throne in their children's. Their loyalty had nowhere else to go but to the crown that had raised them. It was a real position of confidence, real wealth, and real influence, and this man appears to have held it for the most powerful woman on a continent Rome had failed to conquer. That is, the first world. Here is the second. He had crossed roughly 1,500 miles by boat, by caravan, through desert, to reach Jerusalem because he wanted to worship the God of Israel. Luke doesn't tell us when this devotion started, whether he was raised toward it or found it later, only that it was real enough to survive a journey most people in the ancient world would never attempt even once. He arrived at the temple wanting nothing more complicated than to stand before God with everyone else who had come to do the same thing. And there, ancient Jewish law had already decided something about him before he ever crossed the threshold. Deuteronomy 23:1 states plainly that no one who has been emasculated may enter the assembly of the Lord. Whether that boundary was enforced as a hard physical barrier at the Jerusalem temple in this exact period, or functioned more as a formal exclusion from full covenant membership, ancient sources don't give us a single tidy answer. But either way, the text he had traveled a continent to honor was also the text that drew a line he could not cross by definition of his own body, a condition assigned to him, not chosen. He could get close. He could not get all the way in. So picture the contrast the way he must have lived it in the space of a single week. In Meroë, he stands beside the treasury of a queen, trusted with more gold than most men in Judea would see in a lifetime, his word carrying weight in a royal court. In Jerusalem, he stands outside a boundary he cannot cross, in a city where his rank means nothing, holding a devotion the building itself was not built to fully receive. Powerful everywhere else, outside here, he didn't walk away from Jerusalem. Luke tells us what he did instead. He bought a scroll. Isaiah, most likely the Greek translation known as the Septuagint, since Luke has him reading a passage word for word from that version. A scroll like this was not cheap. It represented real money and real intention. Whatever door had stayed shut in front of him, he was not finished looking for God on the other side of it. He got back into his chariot for the long road home, and he opened the scroll anyway. Before the road, before the chariot, before any of it, what did it actually cost this man to become who he was? Scripture doesn't give us his personal history the way it does for figures who appear across many books. There's no earlier chapter where we meet him as a boy in Meroë, but the historical record around the role he held tells us something real, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The practice of using eunuchs in royal courts across the ancient Near East, Egypt, and Nubia is well documented by historians of the period, not as a rare curiosity, but as a standard feature of how palaces were run. The reasoning ancient writers give is consistent. A man in this position could rise to extraordinary trust, closer to the throne than almost anyone, precisely because he represented no dynastic threat. He could hold the treasury without ever being suspected of building one of his own to pass to a son. In a court built on suspicion of rivals, that made him unusually safe to elevate. Whether this man arrived at that position by his own choice, by circumstance, or by a decision made for him earlier in life, perhaps in childhood, as was common in some ancient practices tied to court service, the text never says, and neither will we. What we can say is that his advancement and his condition were bound together. The very thing that opened the door to the treasury of a queen was also, by definition, the thing that would close a different door in Jerusalem before he ever reached it. That's the first real movement in his story, and it happened long before Philip ever saw his chariot on the road. It's the choice or the circumstance that placed him permanently between two systems of belonging, fully inside one hierarchy and structurally outside another. The second movement is the one Luke does give us directly. He decided to go to Jerusalem at all. This wasn't a small errand. Getting from Meroë to Judea in the first century meant a journey along the Nile, likely by boat for a significant stretch, followed by overland travel through Egypt and across the Sinai, or up through the coastal route toward Gaza and Jerusalem. Weeks of travel each way, arranged around a man whose job did not pause simply because he wanted to worship. Someone in his position would have needed to arrange escorts, provisions, and enough absence from the treasury to make the trip possible. This was not a spontaneous pilgrimage. It required planning that only a man of real means and real determination could carry out. And here is where the story quietly resists an easy assumption. If we're honest about the shape of Deuteronomy 23:1, this man likely knew or could have known before he ever left Meroe that the temple's inner boundaries were not built to fully receive someone in his position. He was not a man walking toward Jerusalem in ignorance of what he'd find there. Ancient Jewish communities existed well beyond Judea's borders by this period. In Egypt, along trade routes, in cities with substantial Jewish populations, and a treasury official in regular contact with movement of goods and information across the region would plausibly have had some exposure to Jewish practice and law before setting foot in the temple courts himself. If that's true, the trip becomes something sharper than simple devotion. It becomes a decision to go anyway, to travel a continent's length toward a boundary he may have already suspected would hold, because being near it still meant more to him than staying comfortably far from it. That's the price this man had already paid before Philip ever entered the story, not the price of the exclusion itself. Scripture never asks us to treat that boundary as a punishment for something he did, but the price of choosing to keep showing up to a God who, at least in that building, on that day, could not fully receive him back. There's one more detail worth pausing on before we move to the road itself, because it's easy to read past it. Luke tells us this man was reading aloud, out loud enough that Philip could hear him from outside the chariot before he ever climbed in. A normal practice for reading in antiquity, but it also tells us plainly that he could read. Literacy of this kind, in a second language, from an expensive imported scroll, was not common. It marks him again as a man of education and resources, not a desperate outsider begging at the gate. He didn't need Jerusalem to validate his intelligence or his worth. He needed something the city had failed to give him anyway. He worshipped anyway. He bought the scroll anyway. And when the moment came to head home, he opened it not to a psalm of celebration, but to a chapter about someone else who had been excluded, silenced, and cut off before his time. Isaiah 53. Whether he chose that passage on purpose or simply happened to be reading where his scroll fell open, Luke gives us no way to know for certain. But the words waiting for him there were about to matter more than either possibility alone could explain. To understand the weight of the passage this man was reading, we have to sit for a moment inside the actual walls of the Jerusalem temple, because excluded is an abstract word until you see what it looked like in stone. The temple complex Herod had rebuilt was organized in concentric courts, each one narrowing who was permitted to go further in. The outermost court, the court of the Gentiles, was open to nearly anyone. Beyond that, barriers marked out who could proceed, and archaeology has confirmed exactly how seriously those barriers were enforced. Inscribed warning stones from the temple, written in Greek, have survived to this day, and their message was blunt. No foreigner may enter beyond the balustrade, on pain of death. This wasn't a polite suggestion. It was a wall with teeth. We don't know precisely how the exclusion named in Deuteronomy 23.1 was applied in daily practice at this particular temple, in this particular decade. But we do know the culture that produced those warning stones was a culture serious about boundaries, and a man whose very body placed him in a category the law named directly would have felt those boundaries acutely, whether he was stopped at a specific stone barrier or simply understood without needing to be told twice how far his welcome extended. Now hold that image next to the world he came from. In Meroë, he stood inside the innermost circles of power, trusted with a queen's wealth, likely present in rooms where policy for a kingdom was decided. Here, in the city he had crossed a continent to reach, he stood on the outer edge of a courtyard designed to keep people like him at a careful distance from the presence the whole building existed to house. That is not a small contradiction to carry home in a chariot. And there was more pressing on him than the stone itself. Consider what it likely meant socially back in Meroë to be a man in his position, respected for his competence, but also permanently set apart from the ordinary rhythms of family life that defined belonging for most people in the ancient world. no wife in the conventional sense, no children to carry his name forward, no lineage to be folded into. His identity had to be built entirely on function. What he did for the crown? Because the paths most people use to answer the question, "Who do I belong to?" were closed to him by the same circumstance that elevated his career. Two systems, two forms of exclusion, and both of them rooted in the same fact about his body that he had not chosen for himself. Powerful in one world, and functionally without family. Devoted in a second world, and formally kept at its edge. There was practical pressure riding alongside him, too, and it shouldn't be dismissed. A man entrusted with an entire royal treasury does not simply vanish from his post for months at a time without consequence. Every week spent traveling toward Jerusalem was a week the court in Meroë managed without him, a window in which rivals could quietly work to make his absence look like negligence, or worse, disloyalty. Trust at that level of a royal court was rarely permanent. It had to be maintained. He had staked real political capital on this trip, on top of everything else he was carrying, and every mile of the return journey moved him closer to a court that would expect results to justify the absence, and further from a temple that had just told him, without needing to say it aloud, exactly where he stood. So he sat in that chariot holding two unresolved accounts at once, one measured in gold and the confidence of a queen, the other measured in belonging, and currently running at a deficit he had traveled 1,500 miles to try to close. It's worth asking honestly what a man carries after a week like that, not because we can diagnose his emotions with certainty the text doesn't give us, but because the shape of the situation itself tells us something. A person doesn't need a clinical label to feel the particular ache of belonging fully nowhere, of being trusted with everything except the one thing that would let you simply belong without qualification, without exception, without a wall. If you've ever done everything right and still ended up standing outside the room you worked hardest to get into, not because you failed, but because of something about you that was decided before you had any say in it, you already understand something about this man that Luke never had to spell out. Tell us in the comments if a moment like that has ever shaped how you see belonging. He was still turning the pages of Isaiah when his chariot rolled south out of Jerusalem, back toward the long desert road to Gaza, carrying a scroll about a suffering servant and a body that the city behind him had just finished explaining it could not fully receive. Luke tells the next part of the story from Philip's side first, and it's worth noticing how strange the instructions actually are. An angel tells Philip to leave a thriving ministry in Samaria, where crowds were responding, where the work was visibly working, and go instead to a desert road, not a city, not a synagogue, a wilderness route between Jerusalem and Gaza, the kind of place you travel through, not toward. Philip goes anyway, and Luke says the Spirit tells him directly, go up and join that chariot. One man, one road, one very specific assignment. The text treats this meeting as too important to be left to coincidence. When Philip catches up, he hears the official reading Isaiah aloud, likely the Greek Septuagint translation, since the exact wording Luke records matches that version closely, rather than the original Hebrew. And Philip asks the question the whole scene turns on. Do you understand what you are reading? The official's answer is worth sitting with because it isn't defensive. How can I unless someone explains it to me? He invites Philip up into the chariot, a stranger, a foreigner from Galilee, invited to sit beside a royal treasurer without hesitation. Whatever this man's rank had cost him at the temple gate, it clearly hadn't made him too proud to admit what he didn't know. The passage he's reading is Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, and the specific lines Luke quotes are unmistakable. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth. Then comes the question that reorganizes everything. Tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else? This is not a small technical question about authorship. Read carefully. It's a question this specific man had every reason to ask with more than academic curiosity. Isaiah 53 describes someone humiliated, someone silenced, someone cut off before his line could continue. Who can speak of his descendants is the same wound in different language that Deuteronomy 23.1 had already pointed at when it excluded men without descendants from the assembly. Whether or not he consciously drew that connection, the resonance is there in the text itself, and it is difficult to imagine he read those particular lines and felt nothing familiar in them. Philip's answer, Luke tells us simply, began with that very passage and told him the good news about Jesus. Philip explains that the suffering, the silence, the being cut off, all of it belonged to Jesus, executed weeks earlier in the very city this man had just left. A man who was excluded, who bore rejection that wasn't his fault, who was cut off from the land of the living, and who was raised. That is the turn, not a new law, not an argument about whether the temple boundary was fair. A person who had already walked the road this official knew from the inside. Exclusion, silence, being cut off, and who came out the other side of it alive. We don't get Philip's full sermon. Luke compresses what was almost certainly a longer conversation into a single verse, but we get the result of it a few verses later, and the result tells us the message landed exactly where it needed to. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the official said, "Look, here is water. What prevents me from being baptized?" There's one more piece of Isaiah worth naming here, because it's easy to miss, and it may well have been part of what Philip explained. Just a few chapters after the passage this man was reading in Isaiah 56, the same prophet records a promise addressed specifically to men in his exact situation. "Let no eunuch complain. I am only a dry tree. For this is what the Lord says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, I will give them within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. The very scroll he had purchased in Jerusalem, the scroll he was holding in his hands on that road, already contained in the same book both the wound that resembled his own and a direct answer to it. We can't know for certain whether he had read that far or whether Philip pointed him to it during their conversation, but the fact that it sits inside the same document he chose to carry home is difficult to read as coincidence. Whatever line had kept him standing outside a building in Jerusalem, this man had just heard something that made him believe, with enough confidence, to ask the question out loud, that the line no longer applied to him. Not because the law had changed, but because of who Jesus was and what had already happened to him. Here is exactly where the record ends. Luke writes, Then Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. That is the last sentence in the entire New Testament about this man. No name given, no return trip mentioned. No later chapter where he reappears. Philip is swept off to Azotus and continues his ministry along the coast. Luke follows him, not the man in the chariot. So what do we actually know, and where exactly does it stop? We know he was baptized on his own request, with no delay and no additional requirement placed on him. We know he had a scroll of Isaiah in his possession, purchased with his own resources, meaning he left that desert road not just changed internally, but carrying quite literally the text that had just been opened up to him. We know his destination, home, to the royal court at Meroë, where a treasury and a queen were waiting for an explanation of where he'd been. And we know he was, in Luke's own word, rejoicing, not relieved, not merely satisfied, rejoicing. Everything past that point belongs to the territory this channel exists to explore carefully. Not because the questions aren't worth asking, but because Luke chose deliberately not to answer them for us. What happens when a man with this much responsibility returns to a royal court holding a new conviction about a crucified and risen Jewish teacher, in a kingdom with its own established religious traditions? The text never tells us whether he faced resistance, curiosity, indifference, or something else entirely from the court he served. It is possible his position gave him unusual freedom to hold a private conviction quietly. The way a man trusted with a treasury might also be trusted to keep his own counsel. It is equally possible that a man of his visibility couldn't have kept something like this fully private, even if he tried. Court officials were watched, and a change in a trusted man's behavior rarely goes unnoticed for long. We simply don't know which was true for him. What we can say with more confidence is historical rather than personal. This man's baptism is the first individual conversion account in Acts explicitly involving someone from beyond the traditional boundaries of Israel and Samaria, occurring even before Peter's encounter with Cornelius the Roman centurion a few chapters later. Whatever happened to him personally afterward, his story sits at a documented turning point in how the earliest church understood who the message was for. Consider, too, what it may have cost him simply to carry this alone for a while, whatever eventually happened at court. He had no other believer beside him on that long road home, no community of people who had shared the same experience, no one in Meroë who would understand immediately what had shifted in him at a spring somewhere between Jerusalem and Gaza. The very isolation that had shaped so much of his life before this moment may well have continued in a new form afterward, even as the deeper isolation, the sense of standing permanently outside, had already been answered. It is possible that rejoicing and loneliness sat side by side in him for a while, the way they often do in anyone who has changed before the people around them have had the chance to catch up. There is also a tradition, later than Scripture, and clearly identified here as tradition rather than fact, that credits this man, or converts connected to his witness, with helping establish Christian communities in the Nile Valley region generations before more famous missionary efforts reached the same territory. Early church historians writing centuries afterward, including Eusebius, mention this connection. We cannot verify it the way we can verify what Luke records directly. And a canal built on honesty has to say so plainly. But it isn't a random legend invented from nothing either. It emerges from a region with a genuinely deep and ancient Christian history, one that predates much of what many modern readers assume about how Christianity reached Africa. One plausible possibility, consistent with everything the text does confirm. A man once excluded from full standing in the community he traveled furthest to reach became, quietly or not, someone through whom that same community's message reached a kingdom Jerusalem itself had never fully welcomed him into. If that is even partly true, the shape of it is difficult to read as coincidence. The very boundary that kept him out in one direction became, in the other direction, a road nobody else was positioned to travel. We cannot know for certain. What we can know is this: the last word Luke gives us about him isn't loss, and it isn't unresolved grief. It's joy held by a man walking home to a life we're never shown, carrying a scroll that had just told him, in writing he could read for himself, that he already belonged. There's a particular kind of tired that doesn't come from failing. It comes from doing everything right and still ending up outside the room, the group, the relationship, the version of belonging you worked hardest to earn for a reason that was never fully in your control to begin with. Maybe it isn't a body, the way it was for this man. Maybe it's a diagnosis you didn't choose, a family you were born into or lost, a mistake someone else made that became the story people tell about you anyway. a category assigned to you before you had any say in the matter, that somehow still determines which rooms open and which ones don't. You can be excellent at what you do, trusted by people who matter, carrying real weight and real responsibility, and still feel in the one place you most wanted to belong, like you're standing at a boundary somebody else drew a long time before you arrived. If that's familiar, you already understand something about the man in this story that no commentary needed to explain to you. Here's what his story quietly corrects in how we tend to read exclusion. It would be easy to assume that because a door was closed to him, God had also written him off, that the boundary at the temple was the final word on his worth or his welcome. The story doesn't let that assumption stand. The very book he carried out of the city, he'd been kept at the edge of contained a few pages further on, a direct promise that the door he couldn't get through was never the whole story. The exclusion was real. It was also not final. That's the reframe worth sitting with. A closed door in one place is not proof of a closed door everywhere, and it is especially not proof of how God sees you. Isaiah 56 doesn't pretend the boundary in Deuteronomy 23 wasn't real. It answers it directly, with a name, a memorial, a place, better than what he'd been told he couldn't have. And there's the comfort worth carrying past this video. What finally reached this man wasn't a change in the law, and it wasn't a personal achievement that finally earned him a way in. It was a person, someone who had already walked through rejection, silence, and being cut off, and who was raised on the other side of it. The passage that named his wound was, without exaggeration, the same passage that introduced him to the one who had carried it first. That's worth saying plainly, because it applies beyond this one story. Whatever boundary you're standing outside of right now, the answer was never going to be that you finally became impressive enough to earn your way past it. It was always going to be a person who already went through what stands between you and belonging, and who is not asking you to fix yourself before you're welcome. It's worth noticing, too, what he didn't do on that road. He didn't argue with Philip that the exclusion was unfair, even though by most measures it was. He didn't demand the law be rewritten before he'd accept what Philip was offering him. He simply asked the honest question in front of him: who is this passage actually about? And let the answer take him somewhere new. There's something worth learning in that alone. Sometimes the way forward isn't winning an argument about the door that closed, but asking a better question about what's actually in front of you right now. The next step here isn't complicated, and it isn't a formula either. It's simply this: if there's a place in your life where you've quietly decided you're on the outside for good, it might be worth reading that decision again, the way this man reread a scroll he already owned and found something in it he hadn't seen the first time. The door you assumed was closed permanently might only have been closed for now, in that one place, under that one set of terms. He didn't wait for Jerusalem to change its policy. He didn't need it to. He found, on a desert road, that the welcome he was looking for had never actually depended on that city at all. A man crossed a continent to stand at the edge of a room he wasn't fully let into, and he still found what he came for. Just not where he expected it, and not from who he expected it from. That's the part of this story I keep coming back to. Sometimes the welcome we're looking for isn't waiting behind the door we've been knocking on. It's waiting somewhere further down the road, in a conversation we didn't plan for, with someone we didn't expect to be the one who finally explains it to us. He never went back to argue his case at that gate. He didn't need to. He'd already found, on an ordinary stretch of desert road, that belonging had never actually been in that building's hands to give or withhold in the first place. If this one landed somewhere honest in you, tell us in the comments which part felt closest to something in your own life. We read every one of them. Wherever you're reading this from tonight, I hope you find, like he did, that the door you thought was closed was never the only one. God bless you all.